My name is Aaron Holt. I am 37 years old, and for the past 3 years I have worked as a seasonal remote graveyard lookout for the State Forestry Service. My assignment is a steel-framed fire observation tower set on a granite ridge more than 40 miles from the nearest paved road. The tower is accessible only by a service trail that is locked and monitored, and once the winter rotation begins, no one else is stationed within radio range overnight. I accepted the position because I preferred isolation, because I trusted routine, and because the job was supposed to be uneventful. What happened last night did not violate any official protocol, but it changed the way the fog behaved, and it changed the way I understand this place. I arrived for my shift just before dusk, signed into the logbook, checked the weather instruments, and completed the same procedural steps I had followed hundreds of times before. Barometric pressure was steady, wind was negligible, and visibility was listed as moderate with fog expected after midnight. The fog was not unusual. It rolls up the valleys and settles against the ridgelines every night this time of year. I noted it, initialed the line, and didn't give it another thought. The radio check with base was clear and brief. They reminded me to log hourly observations and to report any anomalies. At the time, I did not consider that word applicable to anything that could happen out here. By full dark, the tower was surrounded by a low, pale layer of fog that hovered below the platform, like a calm, flat lake. From above, it usually looks peaceful. The stars were visible overhead, and the forest canopy was completely obscured beneath the mist. I brewed coffee, set my headlamp on its hook, and began my first overnight observation cycle. Everything was normal. The anemometer barely moved. The fog level remained consistent. The only sounds were the slow ticking of the instrument panel and the occasional creak of the tower settling in the cold. At 12:14 a.m., I noticed the fog rising. This alone was not alarming. Fog lifts and falls with temperature shifts, and the air had cooled faster than expected. I logged the change and continued my routine, scanning the horizon with binoculars and marking landmarks that emerged and vanished along the ridge. What caught my attention was not the movement itself, but the way it happened. The fog did not thin as it rose. It did not drift or spread. Climbed in a smooth, vertical motion, like water filling a container. Within minutes, it reached the level of the platform and pressed against the railings, pale and dense, swallowing the lower half of the tower. When fog reaches the platform, visibility usually drops to a few feet, and moisture beads on every surface. This time, the air remained dry. The fog stopped just short of the floor, as if respecting a boundary. I leaned over the railing and shone my headlamp downward. The beam cut a clean tunnel through the mist, revealing the staircase for exactly 6 steps before vanishing. The fog below was not swirling or shifting. It was still, unnaturally still, like a solid mass. I told myself to stop overanalyzing. Fatigue plays tricks on perception during overnight shifts. I logged the observation and returned inside, sealing the door behind me. The cabin felt warmer than it should have. I checked the thermometer twice to confirm it hadn't malfunctioned. The temperature was stable. There was no reason for the sudden heaviness in the air. No explanation for the pressure I felt in my ears, like the moment before altitude sickness sets in. At 1:02 a.m., the radio crackled. This was unusual, but not unheard of. Atmospheric conditions sometimes cause interference. I lifted the handset and waited for the signal to resolve into static or a distant transmission. Instead, I heard a single breath. It was close, unfiltered, like someone exhaling directly into the microphone. I froze, listening. After a moment, the channel went silent. I checked the frequency. It was the same dead channel I used for equipment testing, not the base frequency. I had not keyed the mic. I called in to base immediately. They answered after the second ring, alert and professional. I reported the interference, careful to describe only what could be reasonably explained. They suggested atmospheric distortion and advised me to continue monitoring. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When I set the handset back in its cradle, my hand was shaking. The fog reached the windows shortly after. It did not smear or cloud the glass. It stopped inches away, outlining the cabin in a perfect, pale silhouette. I could see its edge clearly, as defined as a shoreline. I pressed my palm against the window. The glass was cold, but the fog beyond it looked dense enough to touch. For reasons I still cannot articulate, I did not open the door to test it. At 2 a.m., I made my hourly log entry. I wrote that visibility was near zero and that fog behavior was irregular. I underlined the word irregular twice. As I finished writing, I noticed something else. The fog outside was no longer level. It had formed a gentle slope, rising higher on the eastern side of the tower, as if responding to something I could not see. I followed the incline with my eyes, heart pounding, until it disappeared into the dark. That was when I heard footsteps on the metal stairs below me. Slow, even, deliberate. I stood perfectly still, listening, counting each step as it climbed through the fog toward the platform. No one was scheduled to be here. No one could reach the tower without passing the locked gate and the motion sensors. The radio was silent. The footsteps continued upward, steady and unhurried, stopping just below the level where the fog met the floor. I did not call out. I did not move. I watched the door, waiting for the handle to turn, knowing that whatever was climbing the stairs was hidden completely by the fog I could not explain. I remained frozen in place for several seconds after the footsteps stopped, my eyes fixed on the door handle as if staring hard enough could prevent it from moving. The fog outside pressed closer to the windows, its edge no longer clean. Pulsed once, subtly, like a slow breath. I told myself the sound on the stairs could have been thermal expansion, metal contracting in the cold, anything that fit inside the rules I understood. Still, my hand drifted toward the radio without conscious decision. I keyed the mic and spoke my call sign, keeping my voice level. There was no immediate response, only a faint hiss. I released the button and waited. The footsteps did not resume. Nothing touched the door. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until it felt louder than noise. I forced myself to move, stepping toward the window closest to the stairwell. The fog there was darker, denser, as if layered. I could not see the stairs anymore, not even the faint outline of the railing. It was as though the tower ended at the platform and everything below had been erased. I logged the auditory disturbance, choosing my words carefully. Unidentified noise from stairwell. I wrote, my pen pressing harder into the paper than necessary. The act of writing grounded me, gave my hands something to do. When I finished the entry, I realized the tower had stopped creaking entirely. No wind, no metal settling, no distant forest sounds. The silence was total. I checked the anemometer again. Zero movement. Outside, the fog no longer sloped. It had leveled out, reaching the same height on all sides, forming a perfect ring around the cabin. At 2:37 a.m., the radio crackled again. This time it was not a breath. It was a voice, sounded like mine. The cadence was wrong, slightly delayed, as if the words were being assembled rather than spoken naturally. Said my name once, clearly using my full first and last name. I did not respond. I did not even breathe. The voice continued, repeating my call sign, then stopping mid-syllable, cutting off as if someone had released the transmit button too early. The channel indicator flickered briefly, then returned to normal. I checked the frequency again. Still the dead channel. Still no reason for transmission. I contacted base a second time. They answered, sounding irritated now, but attentive. I reported radio interference again, adding that I believed I was hearing feedback of my own voice. There was a pause on their end, longer than before. Then they told me to switch to standby mode and to document everything until morning. No further instructions. No reassurance. When the line went dead, the quiet felt intentional, like a decision had been made without me. The fog began to move again, but not upward, pressed inward. I watched it slide closer to the cabin walls, the distance shrinking inch by inch. It did not behave like vapor. There was no drift, no curl, no response to the slight vibration of the tower when I shifted my weight. It moved as a single mass, uniform and controlled. I backed away from the windows, suddenly aware of how exposed the glass made me feel. The cabin was designed for visibility, not defense. Every side offered a clear view of whatever was out there. The footsteps resumed without warning. This time they did not climb. They circled. Metal rang softly as something moved around the perimeter of the platform, step by measured step. I could hear the rhythm clearly now. It was wrong in a way I struggled to articulate. Too consistent, too careful. Human footsteps vary, even unconsciously. These did not. They traced the cabin's outline perfectly, stopping briefly at each window, lingering just long enough for me to feel watched. I crouched beside the instrument console, heart pounding so hard it made my vision blur. My mind raced through every plausible explanation and discarded them as quickly as they formed. No one could be up here unnoticed. No one could move like that. I considered turning on the exterior floodlight, then dismissed the idea immediately. I did not want to know what the fog would reveal if it pulled back. The radio clicked on again. This time, the voice spoke without distortion. It sounded calm, professional, sounded like me on a good day. "Aaron," it said, "you can log this as resolved." The words made no sense, but the tone carried authority. I felt an almost overwhelming urge to obey, to write it down, to make the situation fit inside the structure of my job. My hand twitched toward the logbook before I caught myself. The footsteps stopped directly outside the door. I could hear nothing else. No breathing, no movement, just presence. I stared at the handle, waiting for it to turn. Didn't. Instead, the fog outside the window nearest the door thinned just enough to show a shape where no shape should have been. It was not a silhouette, not a figure, but a distortion, like heat rising from asphalt. The glass vibrated faintly once, twice, then went still. The radio fell silent. I did not sleep after that. I stayed awake, watching the fog, listening to the tower, waiting for morning that felt impossibly far away. I checked my watch repeatedly after that, convinced time had slowed or slipped out of alignment with my body. The seconds advanced normally, but each minute felt stretched thin, like it was being pulled apart and examined before being allowed to pass. I remained crouched beside the console until my legs began to cramp, afraid that any movement might invite whatever was waiting outside to act. The fog stayed close to the windows, no longer pressing inward, but not retreating either. It held its position with unnerving patience. At 3:11 a.m., I forced myself to stand. I told myself that staying immobile was not a plan. I was trained to observe, to document, to remain functional under stress. I moved slowly, deliberately, making sure my boots did not scrape the floor. The cabin felt smaller than it had hours earlier, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. I checked the door seal, running my fingers along the frame. It was intact. No gaps, no condensation. The fog outside still did not behave like moisture. It left no residue, no droplets, no streaks on the glass. I made another log entry, my handwriting tighter now, more controlled than I felt. I described the radio transmission verbatim. I described the footsteps. I avoided speculation. I avoided words like impossible or unreal. When I finished, I realized I had written the exact phrase the voice used over the radio. Log this as resolved. I did not remember deciding to include it. I scratched it out so hard the paper nearly tore. The fog shifted again, subtly this time, and I noticed something I hadn't before. It wasn't uniformly pale. There were darker currents moving through it, slow and deliberate, like shadows beneath ice. They did not form shapes, but they moved with intent, converging and separating as if responding to signals I couldn't perceive. I leaned closer to the window despite myself, trying to understand the pattern. That was when I saw the imprint. It appeared on the fog-facing side of the glass, not as condensation but as pressure. A shallow depression, perfectly oval at about chest height. It looked like someone had pressed their forehead gently against the window. The glass did not flex. The imprint remained for several seconds, then slowly faded as the fog redistributed itself. I stepped back so abruptly I nearly fell. The radio clicked once, sharply, like a punctuation mark. No voice followed. Instead, the background noise shifted. I heard what sounded like wind moving through trees, distant and muffled, even though the anemometer still read 0 and the forest below was completely obscured. The sound grew louder, resolving into something closer, more specific. Footsteps again, but not on metal this time. On dirt, on leaves, surrounding the tower from below. I realized then that the fog was carrying sound in ways it shouldn't. It wasn't muffling noise. It was channeling it, directing it upward, focusing it. Every step below felt amplified, intentional. I imagined dozens of paths converging toward the base of the tower, all of them hidden beneath the same smooth, unnatural blanket. At 3:46 a.m., the exterior floodlight turned on by itself. I did not touch the switch. I was standing several feet away when the light flared to life, bathing the fog in harsh white glare. For a split second, visibility improved. I saw the top of the staircase, the railing, the first few steps descending into nothing. Then the fog reacted. It pulled back violently, not dispersing, but retreating as a solid wall, dropping away from the platform in a sudden vertical collapse. What it revealed beneath it made my stomach turn cold. The stairs were clear, but they were not empty. There were footprints on every step, dozens of them, overlapping and precise, all facing upward. They were identical in size and shape. None of them belonged to me. They ended abruptly at the platform, stopping exactly where the fog had been moments earlier. Below that point, the staircase vanished again into white. The floodlight flickered once, twice, then shut off. The fog surged back into place instantly, erasing the footprints, sealing the view. The silence returned, heavier than before. I stood there, shaking, unable to reconcile what I had seen with any rational explanation. My training offered nothing. My experience offered nothing. There was no protocol for this. The radio came alive one last time before dawn. This time, the voice did not imitate me. Spoke plainly, without distortion, without authority. It sounded almost tired. "You don't belong to the version that leaves," it said. I screamed into the microphone, demanded clarification, demanded help, demanded anything. The channel went dead. Bass did not respond. The instruments remained steady, mocking in their normalcy. Slowly, as the first hint of gray appeared in the sky, the fog began to thin naturally, breaking apart into wisps and curls the way it always should have. By the time the sun crested the ridge, the tower stood clear and silent, surrounded by ordinary forest and empty air. The stairs were clean. The radio functioned normally. Bass finally called in, asking for my final report. I told them the fog had been unusually dense. I told them there were radio issues. I told them I was requesting reassignment. They approved it without question. I left the tower just after sunrise. As I descended the stairs, I noticed something carved into the underside of the platform, hidden from view unless you knew to look. It was a single sentence, etched deeply into the metal. Resolved. I reached the bottom of the tower just after sunrise, my legs stiff and my hands still trembling from the climb down. Daylight should have made everything feel safer. Didn't. The forest looked exactly as it always had. Pine, granite, low brush, the service trail winding away between the trees. But the normalcy felt staged, like a set that had been carefully reset after something went wrong. I stood there longer than necessary, listening, waiting for any sign that the night hadn't truly ended. Nothing happened. I followed procedure and checked the locked equipment shed at the base of the tower. The padlock was intact. The seal hadn't been disturbed. I signed the final line in the overnight log I carried in my pack, noting the time of descent and the weather conditions at ground level. Fog dissipating. Visibility improving. Wind light. Each word felt dishonest, but they were accurate in the narrow way reports are meant to be. As I started down the service trail, the radio at my shoulder crackled softly. I froze, hand hovering over the handset. Then bass came through, clear and normal, asking me to confirm I was off the tower and beginning my exit. I answered yes. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, too controlled. They acknowledged and reminded me to check in again when I reached the gate. The transmission ended cleanly. No breathing, no delay, no echo of myself. The trail descended through a shallow saddle before curving east. Morning light filtered through the trees in pale bands, and birds had begun to call, tentative at first, then louder as the fog thinned. I focused on those sounds, grounding myself in them, letting the rhythm of walking pull me forward. I told myself the night was over, that whatever I had experienced was tied to darkness and fatigue and isolation. I repeated that thought until it almost sounded convincing. About 20 minutes into the hike, I noticed the fog again. It wasn't ahead of me. It wasn't behind me. It ran alongside the trail, parallel to my path, lingering between the trunks just off to my left. It moved at the same pace I did, neither gaining nor falling back. When I stopped, it stopped. When I took a step forward, it slid forward too, smooth and quiet. I told myself it was a coincidence, a trick of perspective. Still, I adjusted my route slightly, stepping off the trail for a moment to test it. The fog adjusted with me. I felt the first real surge of panic then, sharp and hot. I forced myself back onto the trail and kept walking, refusing to look directly at the fog again. I checked my watch. It was still early morning. Full daylight was less than an hour away. I had cell reception intermittently along this stretch, but I did not try to use it. I didn't want to explain what I couldn't prove. I didn't want to hear my own voice reflected back at me from another device. The fog began to thin as the trail widened near the old maintenance clearing. For a moment I felt relief. Then I saw what had been revealed beneath it. The ground on the left side of the trail was marked with footprints. They were not pressed into mud or dust. They were impressions in pine needles and loose gravel, impossibly clean and uniform, forming a narrow line that mirrored the trail's edge exactly. They did not cross the trail. They did not wander. They simply followed, step for step, keeping perfect distance. I knelt to examine one without thinking, then immediately regretted it. The print was the same size as my boot. The tread pattern was different. I stood quickly and resumed walking, my pace faster now. The footprints continued alongside me, appearing and disappearing as the fog shifted, never quite fully exposed, never fully hidden. I could feel myself being measured, compared, evaluated. The phrase from the radio returned to me unbidden. You don't belong to the version that leaves. I didn't know what that meant, but I felt certain it wasn't a threat. It was an assessment. When I reached the locked gate near the trailhead, the fog finally broke apart completely, dissolving into harmless wisps that drifted away into the trees. The footprints vanished with it. I unlocked the gate, stepped through, and locked it again behind me. Only then did I allow myself to breathe deeply. I checked in with base as instructed. They logged my exit time and asked if I required medical attention. I said no. They reminded me that my reassignment would take effect immediately and that transportation would meet me at the ranger station by mid-morning. The conversation was routine, efficient, forgettable. When it ended, I felt strangely hollow. As I waited by the roadside, I noticed something new on my boot. A fine, pale residue clung to the sole, packed deep into the tread. It wasn't dirt. It wasn't ash. It smelled faintly metallic, like cold air before a storm. I scraped it away with a stick until the grooves were clean. When the truck arrived and I climbed inside, I did not look back toward the ridge. I didn't need to. I already knew the tower was there, standing exactly as it always had, waiting for the next person willing to watch the fog and write down what they thought they saw. I arrived at the ranger station just before mid-morning, handed over my keys, and signed the final transfer paperwork without reading most of it. The clerk behind the counter did not ask questions. She slid the forms toward me, pointed where to initial, and thanked me for completing my rotation. Her tone suggested this was not the first time someone had left that tower earlier than planned. I tried to study her face for recognition or concern, but she avoided eye contact, already moving on to the next task. While I waited for my ride back to town, I used the station restroom to wash my hands. The water ran clear, cold, ordinary. As I dried them, I noticed the same pale residue along the cuffs of my pants, faint but unmistakable. It clung in thin streaks, like dust that had settled unevenly. I brushed it away with my fingers. It smeared slightly, then disappeared, leaving the fabric clean. I told myself it was mineral grit from the trail. I told myself a lot of things that morning. The drive out of the forest took nearly 2 hours. As the elevation dropped, the fog vanished completely, replaced by open sky and clear air. Cell service returned in full bars. My phone buzzed with delayed notifications, messages from friends, missed calls from family, all arriving at once like nothing unusual had happened. I answered a few texts, keeping my replies short and neutral. I did not mention the night. I did not mention the tower. I wasn't sure how to frame it in words that wouldn't immediately sound wrong. By early afternoon, I was back in my apartment, surrounded by familiar walls and controlled noise. I unpacked my bag methodically, laying out each item on the table. Flashlight, spare batteries, logbook copy, gloves, jacket. Everything looked normal. Everything smelled faintly of pine and metal. I showered, scrubbing until my skin was raw, but the sensation of pressure in my ears lingered, like I was still at altitude. When I stepped out, wrapped in a towel, I noticed the radio sitting on the kitchen counter where I had left it. I hadn't unpacked it yet. I stood there for a long time, staring at the handset, half expecting it to turn on by itself. Didn't. I reminded myself that it was a standard issue unit, inert without power, incapable of transmitting outside its designated range. Still, I removed the battery and placed both pieces in separate drawers, as if distance alone could neutralize whatever unease it carried. That night, I tried to sleep. I lay awake listening to the sounds of the building, cataloging them the way I had cataloged the tower. Footsteps in the hallway, water moving through pipes, a distant siren. All of it made sense. All of it fit. When I finally drifted off sometime after midnight, my dreams were shallow and fragmented, filled with pale shapes that never quite resolved into images. I woke just before dawn with the certainty that something was wrong. The air in my bedroom felt thick, heavy against my skin. I sat up slowly, scanning the room. The window was open a few inches, letting in cool morning air. Outside, the city was quiet, streets washed clean by overnight rain. There was no fog, none at all. And yet, the sensation from the tower was back, that feeling of being observed without a clear direction to look. I checked my phone. No new messages, no missed calls. The time read 5:47 a.m. I told myself it was residual stress, that my body was still recalibrating after the shift. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood. That was when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, barely visible against the hardwood floor, appearing only when the light hit them at the right angle. A sequence of shallow impressions leading from the window to the center of the room. They were not wet. They were not dirty. They looked like pressure marks, as if something had briefly rested its weight there before lifting away. I followed them with my eyes, heart hammering, until they stopped several feet from my bed. They were facing me. I backed away slowly until my shoulders hit the wall. The room remained silent. The footprints did not deepen or move. After several seconds, they faded, the floor returning to its original unmarked state. I stood there shaking, every instinct screaming at me to leave, to get out into open space, but I forced myself to breathe, to stay grounded. Nothing else happened that morning. I went to work, answered emails, attended a meeting. I functioned. I smiled when appropriate. No one noticed anything wrong. By afternoon, I almost believed I had imagined the footprints entirely. Almost. When I returned home that evening, there was a message waiting on my answering machine. I didn't recognize the number. The recording was only 3 seconds long, contained no words, just a soft, steady exhale, followed by the faint sound of metal settling. I deleted the message and unplugged the machine. I don't know if what followed me down from the tower was the fog itself or something that learned how to move with it. I only know that since that night, I have begun to notice subtle changes in places fog should not behave. Along riverbanks, between buildings, in the low corners of empty rooms. It doesn't approach me the way it did before. Keeps pace. It wasn't a conscious decision at first. I simply realized, a few days later, that I no longer trusted the language used to describe fog. Words like light, patchy, lifting, expected. They implied randomness, passivity. What I had seen did not behave passively. It responded. It adjusted. And once I noticed that distinction, I began seeing it everywhere. I returned to work the following week in a different role, desk-based, administrative. No towers, no overnight shifts, no isolation. The building was busy, fluorescent lit, filled with overlapping conversations and the constant hum of machines. On paper, it should have been the safest possible environment. For the first few days, I felt almost normal. The pressure in my ears faded. My sleep improved. I stopped dreaming about pale shapes and stairwells. Then the fog came back into my routine. Started small. A low layer along the river on my morning commute, clinging to the surface of the water even as the sun rose high enough to burn it away everywhere else. It didn't alarm me until I noticed it keeping pace with my car, stretching along the embankment at the same speed, thinning when traffic slowed, thickening when it moved again. When I took a different route the next day, it wasn't there. When I returned to the river road, it was. I didn't tell anyone. I had already learned the limits of what could be explained without consequence. Instead, I began documenting again, privately this time. I kept a notebook in my bag and wrote down dates, locations, weather conditions. I avoided emotional language. I avoided conclusions. I wrote the way I had been trained to write, as if clarity alone could keep something contained. The entries became more frequent. Fog lingering in alleyways long after sunrise. A low haze forming in the underground parking garage at work, confined to a single row of empty spaces. A faint, pale smear outside my bathroom mirror that vanished the moment I tried to focus on it directly. Each time it behaved the same way. It did not approach. It did not retreat. It adjusted its position relative to mine, maintaining a consistent distance that never quite crossed into contact. One evening I tested it. I left my apartment after dark and walked several blocks without a destination, changing direction at random, cutting through side streets and empty lots. The fog appeared in fragments, never fully forming, but always present somewhere just outside my peripheral vision. When I stopped suddenly, it stopped. When I turned, it shifted. The realization settled in slowly and heavily. It wasn't following me. It was tracking me. That night, I found the word resolved written in the condensation on my bathroom mirror. The letters were clean, precise, formed as if by a steady hand. They vanished seconds later, leaving the glass clear and dry. I stood there for a long time, staring at my own reflection, searching for any sign that I was losing control. I found none. My pulse was elevated. My breathing was steady. I was frightened, but I was lucid. I contacted a therapist the next day. I did not tell her about the tower. I did not tell her about the fog. I described anxiety, residual stress, difficulty adjusting after a remote assignment. She nodded, took notes, suggested grounding techniques and regular sleep. She did not look alarmed. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me feel more alone with it. The radio came back into my life without my consent. I found it one morning on my kitchen counter, fully assembled, battery seated, antenna extended. I knew with absolute certainty that I had not put it there. I had stored the components in separate drawers. I checked them. Both drawers were empty. The radio was powered off. I did not touch it. I wrapped it in a towel and placed it in the back of my closet, then sat on the floor until my hands stopped shaking. That afternoon, the fog appeared inside the building where I worked. It gathered near the ceiling of a rarely used stairwell, thin but unmistakable, hovering in defiance of airflow and temperature. No one else seemed to notice it. People passed through without comment, without hesitation. I stood at the bottom of the stairs, staring up, feeling the familiar pressure return to my ears. The fog shifted slightly, aligning itself with the angle of the steps, stopping at the same height it had at the tower. I did not climb the stairs. That night, my phone rang at exactly 2:37 a.m. I answered it before I could stop myself. There was no greeting, no background noise, just silence, deep and intentional. I listened for several seconds, then whispered hello. My voice sounded small, distant. The silence held, then broke with a single sound. Footsteps, metal, slow, even, approaching. I ended the call and turned off my phone. I sat in the dark until morning, every light on, every door locked, every sense tuned outward. Nothing else happened. No message, no imprint, no voice. But the fog was there when dawn came, pooled along the street outside my window, perfectly level, waiting. Whatever changed that night on the tower did not end when I left. Concluded something, and now it seems to be verifying the result. I stopped writing in my notebook after that, not because the fog disappeared, but because the act of documenting it began to feel like participation rather than observation. Each entry made it more consistent, more precise. Patterns tightened, timings aligned. I had the growing sense that whatever was tracking me was using my attention as a reference point, calibrating itself against my awareness. So I closed the notebook, sealed it in a box, and pushed it to the back of a closet. I told myself that ignoring it might loosen whatever connection had formed. Didn't. What changed was the distance. The fog no longer stayed at the edges of my perception. It began appearing closer, more confidently placed. At bus stops, in empty conference rooms, along the far end of my living room at night, gathered just beyond the reach of the lamps. Still did not touch me. It respected that boundary with almost ceremonial care. The pressure in my ears returned in brief waves, usually when I noticed the fog without meaning to. When I focused on something else, it eased. I began avoiding reflective surfaces. Mirrors, windows at night, dark screens. I couldn't articulate why at first, only that reflections made the sense of being observed sharper, more immediate. Eventually, I understood. Reflections implied alignment. They doubled space, created correspondence. The fog behaved best when the world around me was singular and unambiguous. I covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. I dimmed my computer monitor when it wasn't in use. I learned to move through my apartment without looking too closely at glass. At work, small inconsistencies started to appear. Emails I didn't remember sending appeared in my outbox. Calendar events shifted by a few minutes without explanation. Once, during a routine staff meeting, I heard my name spoken softly from the stairwell outside the conference room, timed perfectly to overlap with my supervisor addressing me. No one else reacted. When I checked later, the stairwell was empty and dry, the air normal. I asked for time off. My supervisor approved it immediately, citing accumulated hours I didn't remember earning. The paperwork was already prepared. My signature was already on it. When I pointed this out, she frowned, confused, and suggested I must have signed earlier and forgotten. Her explanation fit neatly into the rules of the world. Mine did not. I stopped pushing. I spent the first day of leave sitting in my apartment, doing nothing, testing stillness the way I once tested movement. For hours, nothing happened. The fog did not appear. The air felt normal. I began to hope that inactivity might starve whatever process had been unfolding. At 2:14 a.m., there was a knock at my door. It was not loud. It was not urgent. 3 measured taps, evenly spaced, delivered with the same careful restraint I had heard in the footsteps on the tower. I did not move. I did not breathe. I watched the door handle, the lock, the thin strip of light beneath the frame. Nothing else followed. No voice. No second attempt. When I finally checked the peephole, the hallway was empty. The fog appeared inside the apartment for the first time the following night. It gathered low to the floor near the front door, thin enough that I might have mistaken it for shadow if it hadn't moved against the grain of the light. It did not spread. It did not rise. It settled into a shallow, deliberate shape, like a boundary being drawn. I stood on the far side of the room, heart pounding, and waited to see if it would cross the threshold. Didn't. Instead, I felt a shift, subtle but unmistakable, like pressure equalizing. The fog thinned, then vanished, leaving the air clear and still. In its place, something else remained. Not a mark, not a sound, a sense of completion. The same feeling I'd had when the word resolved was carved into the metal beneath the tower platform. The same finality. I slept for nearly 12 hours after that. When I woke, the pressure in my ears was gone. The apartment felt ordinary again. Too ordinary. The silence was empty in a way it hadn't been since before the tower. I moved through my morning routine cautiously, waiting for the fog to reappear, for some sign that the boundary had been temporary. Days passed, then a week. Nothing followed me. I started to believe, cautiously, that whatever process had begun on the tower had reached its conclusion, that the assessment, whatever criteria I had unknowingly satisfied, was complete. The thought brought no relief, only a muted unease, like standing in a room immediately after a machine shuts down, unsure whether the silence means success or failure. On the 8th day, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. There was no subject line. The body contained a single sentence. "Thank you for maintaining consistency." I did not reply. I did not delete it either. That night, for the first time since leaving the tower, fog rolled naturally through the city streets, drifting and thinning the way it always had before. I watched it from my window, feeling nothing but distance. It moved without regard for me. It ignored my presence entirely. I should have been relieved. Instead, I realized something that kept me awake until dawn. If the fog no longer needed to track me, then it wasn't waiting anymore. It had learned what it came for. I tried to return to ordinary life after that, but ordinary had shifted in ways I couldn't quite measure. The fog behaved like fog again, drifting aimlessly, obeying weather patterns, lifting when the sun demanded it. That should have been the end of it. Instead, the absence felt louder than the presence ever had. I had grown accustomed to being referenced, tracked, accounted for. Without that quiet pressure at the edge of my awareness, I felt unmoored, like something essential had been removed without explanation. I went back to checking forecasts, almost compulsively, scanning for mentions of low visibility, morning haze, coastal layers. Each time fog was predicted, I waited for the familiar tightening in my ears, the subtle sense of alignment. It never came. The fog no longer acknowledged me. It moved through streets and valleys without adjusting its pace or shape, indifferent in a way that felt deliberate. 2 weeks after the email, I received another message from the Forestry Service. It was a general notice, sent to multiple recipients, announcing an opening for a remote graveyard lookout position. The location was not the tower I had worked in, but another ridge farther north, similar elevation, similar access restrictions. The wording was clinical, routine. I should have deleted it immediately. Instead, I read it 3 times, feeling a strange pull that had nothing to do with nostalgia or professional interest. That night, I dreamed of staircases, not the one at the tower, but dozens of them, overlapping, intersecting at impossible angles, all leading upward into fog I could not see the end of. I was climbing, always climbing, my footsteps perfectly matched by others just out of sight. When I woke, my legs ached as if I had actually been moving. I began noticing subtle changes in my environment again, but they were different this time. Not fog, alignment. People paused when I entered a room, just briefly, like a system recalibrating. Conversations synced with my movements, sentences ending as I passed, resuming when I stopped. Digital clocks around me seemed to tick louder when I paid attention to them, softer when I didn't. None of it was dramatic enough to confront. All of it was precise enough to unsettle me. One evening, while cleaning out the closet, I found the box containing my old notebook. I hadn't opened it since sealing it away. The tape was still intact. When I peeled it back and lifted the lid, the notebook sat exactly where I'd left it, pages filled with careful observations written in my own hand. I flipped through slowly, rereading entries about river fog, parking garages, stairwells. The final page was blank, or it had been. At the bottom of the page, written in ink darker than the rest, was a sentence I did not remember writing. Baseline established. I dropped the notebook like it had burned me. That night, the radio turned on. I had kept it powered down, battery removed again, stored deep in the closet. None of that mattered. I woke at 2:14 a.m. to the sound of static filling my apartment, low and steady, vibrating through the walls. I followed the noise to the closet, every step heavy with dread. The radio sat on the floor, antenna extended, the channel light glowing softly. I didn't touch it. The static resolved into a voice, not mine this time, not anyone I recognized. It was calm, measured, almost gentle. "Observation phase complete," it said. I backed away until I hit the far wall. My heart hammered, but my mind felt strangely clear, as if some part of me had been waiting to hear those words. The voice continued, unfazed by my silence. "Adaptive parameters confirmed. Subject response within acceptable variance." The radio clicked off. I stood there shaking, replaying the words in my head, trying to force them into a framework that didn't imply intention. This wasn't haunting. It wasn't pursuit. It was assessment. I thought back to the tower, to the way the fog had behaved like a boundary, a test environment. I thought about the email thanking me for maintaining consistency. I wasn't being followed. I had been used as a reference. Sleep didn't come after that. At dawn, I stepped outside onto my balcony and looked out over the city. The air was clear, sharp, free of haze. And yet, as the sun rose, I noticed something subtle happening far below. A thin layer of mist began forming along the streets, not drifting, not spreading, but settling into clean lines that mirrored the grid of the city itself. For a moment, just a moment, it aligned perfectly. Then it broke apart, dissolving into ordinary morning air, leaving me with the uneasy certainty that whatever had learned from me no longer needed my proximity to continue. I understood then why the silence felt wrong. The process hadn't ended. It had scaled. I didn't report the radio transmission. There was no category for it anymore. No supervisor who would know what questions to ask. No form that could absorb language like adaptive parameters or observation phase complete without breaking apart. I understood, with a clarity that felt borrowed rather than earned, that reporting it would not stop anything. It would only confirm that I was still willing to participate. So I stopped reacting. Days passed. Weeks. I moved through routines with deliberate neutrality, careful not to add emphasis or resistance. I avoided patterns when I could, varied my schedule, changed routes, limited idle observation. I became very good at being unremarkable. The city remained functional. The fog behaved. The radio stayed silent. On the surface, it looked like recovery. Underneath, something else was settling. I began noticing small, consistent deviations in environments I had no control over. Fog pooling at exact heights across different neighborhoods. Construction scaffolding aligning in ways that created repeating sightlines. Emergency sirens syncing their rise and fall across distant districts. These things didn't center on me anymore. They didn't need to. They referenced something broader, something already calibrated. One afternoon, I passed a public notice board outside a transit station. Among the flyers and lost pet posters was a laminated sheet stamped with a familiar seal, the Forestry Service logo. It announced a temporary closure of a remote lookout tower pending structural review. The listed location matched the ridge north of the one I had worked on. The reason given was vague. Environmental inconsistencies. I stood there longer than necessary, reading the notice again and again. Around me, people came and went without interest. To them, it was just another closure. To me, it felt like confirmation. That night, I dreamed without imagery for the first time in months. No fog, no stairs, no voices, just a sensation of standing perfectly still while something immense adjusted itself around me, like machinery settling into a new tolerance range. When I woke, my ears rang softly, then fell silent. The pressure was gone. Completely. I took that as a warning, not a relief. The final confirmation came a week later, quietly, without spectacle. I received a certified envelope addressed to me by name. Inside was a single-page document, and signed, undated, printed in the same neutral language used in official incident summaries. Thanked me for my service. It stated that my performance had contributed to a successful environmental baseline assessment. It assured me that no further action was required on my part. At the bottom of the page was a line I recognized immediately. Status: resolved. I shredded the document and disposed of it in separate bins across the city. It didn't matter. The word had already been applied. Once to the night, once to the tower, now to me. I still avoid fog when I can, though it no longer seeks me out. When it rolls in, I watch it carefully, not with fear, but with the detached attention of someone who knows what it's capable of. I've learned that it doesn't need to move strangely to be doing its work. Most of the time, it behaves exactly as expected. That's the part that keeps me awake. Because whatever changed in the fog that night wasn't an anomaly. It wasn't a haunting or a failure of nature. It was a process running exactly as designed, testing boundaries, refining conditions, learning how environments and people respond when watched closely enough. I was never the target. I was the control. And now, when I see job postings for remote graveyard lookouts, when I read about missing shifts quietly reassigned or towers taken offline without explanation, I understand the pattern well enough to know this. The fog isn't looking for someone anymore. It's rolling out updates,